My name is Ron Linde, and I have done a lot of research and interviews related to Red Wing art pottery. In the later 1800s, the potteries of Red Wing were primarily producing stoneware for utilitarian uses, but there were some production of jardinières, urns, umbrella stands, cookie jars, and planters that were done at that time, like a replica of the Cleveland vase, which was given to Grover Cleveland and his wife as they passed through Red Wing on a train in 1887. As we get into the 1900s, the stoneware production began to drop. There were several contributing factors. There was the production of more affordable glass containers and jars. There was the advent of electricity and refrigeration. And after these mergers and closings, the Red Wing Union Stoneware Company emerged as the producer of stoneware and artware in 1906. In the 1920s, the Red Wing Union Stoneware Company introduced many new brushware items. This form pottery was often colored with a stain that was quickly brushed away to reveal some of the clay that was underneath it. Here we have several examples in our gardenware display that were made during the 1920s. There are examples of jardinières, bird baths, a sundial, and other floral containers. These items were all produced into the 20s and late 1920s and sold as early as the 1930s. In the late 1920s, Red Wing Union Stoneware Company built a new tunnel kiln and branched out into the art pottery field and began trials of glazed artware. In August 1931, Red Wing Union Stoneware put out their first major price list that included a full line of glazedware and also brushedware that they were mass producing at this time. Here in the Pottery Museum of Red Wing is an enlarged replica of this sales list with wholesale prices ranging from $1.50 for flower frogs to $126 for jardinières with a pedestal. And those prices were for a dozen items. Here we see the cases of glazed items that were featured on the Red Wing price list from August of 1931. These several cases represent many of the different shapes that were used at this time, and we see outstanding examples of the yellow, green, dark blue, and the Nokomis glaze. The Nokomis glaze that we see here down on the end was described as having a metallic finish in gray and tan with a hint of copper. There are other examples of mulberry, medium blue, and blend glazes in white that were done at the same time, and some large urns, which we see one here in the medium blue color. The next major change in production came when Red Wing Union Stoneware contracted with salesman George Rumrill, who had formed Rumrill Pottery in 1929 in Arkansas. By 1932, several new lines of pottery were being made for Rumrill here in Red Wing. Nearly all of these items have a bottom marking that says Rumrill on them, even though they were made in Red Wing. In addition to these new designs, some of the earlier Red Wing glazedware was finished in new glazes and bottom-marked Rumrill. Over 20 new lines of pottery were produced at the Red Wing Union Stoneware Company for George Rumrill. Among them was the Athena group, which featured the nude female body in the 1930s. They were also the trumpet flower group that characterized features of the trumpet flower in multiple glazes. We have a neoclassic group that was featured by the balls that were on the pieces that made up each form of the many pieces. Many of these lines had anywhere from 8 to 20 some pieces of different shapes. Here we have the Indian group, and here we have the vintage group characterized by the clusters of grape on the pottery item. Next down here we see the fern group, which is characterized by the large fern leaves that were on the pieces. And we also have the shell group. The shell group had bits and pieces of ocean shells that were incorporated into the design. An Empire group had some very classic shapes from the 1930s era, as well as a medieval group. Here we have the pottery made for George Rumrill. That was the Swan group, and the 20-some items featured everything from candlesticks to bowls and vases that had swan figures incorporated into them. We have the Florentine group, which had a flower European look to it, as well as miscellaneous group, where numerous miscellaneum items. There was a hostess group of serving pieces that were made in the 1930s for the perfect hostess. Miniatures were made at that time, as well as floor vases, which were marketed under the Rumrill name. Near the end of the production of Red Wing making pottery for George Rumrill, in 1936, the Red Wing Union Stoneware Company reorganized with a new and likely more appropriate name. They reorganized as Red Wing Potteries. Stoneware was continuing to play a lesser role all the time, and this made the name seem like it was a much better one for the company. The contract with George Rumrill was over by 1937. At the time, managers of Red Wing were then searching for a new designer, and they found Belle Cogan in New York City, one of the earliest women who was designing pottery for the commercial market. She supplied more than 100, probably 150 designs for Red Wing, and asked Red Wing to choose 100 of her designs. And in 1938, Red Wing Potteries introduced the Belle line, the Belle 100, which featured 100 different pieces of Belle Cogan pottery in various shapes and new glazes. And here are good examples of these pieces. In 1939, Belle Cogan added the Terracraft design, which had a series of ridges applied to each piece that she designed for that new line. And Belle Cogan also did some animal figures from this time in late 1939 into 1940. In 1940, Red Wing Potteries introduced the Magnolia line of Belle Cogan that became a very popular seller in the 1940s. These designs were characterized by a raised magnolia flower over the surface of the pottery, and many of them were done in a white cream color with an antique brown over the top, although some other examples have been found with different glazes used on them. In the first 10 years of the art pottery being made at Red Wing, the glazed ware where it was a major production, there were over 1,000 different shapes made of the Red Wing pottery. With this increased production of artware and also an interest in producing more dinnerware, Red Wing Potteries began their search for a resident designer to live in Red Wing. Red Wing Potteries hired Charles E. Murphy, who came with great recommendations from where he trained and worked in Ohio. Murphy began work in December of 1940 and introduced new hand-painted dinnerware and new art pottery designs. By 1942, he had created a newer, more expensive line of artware for jewelry stores and other high-end stores of that time. These gray engobe pieces came in 12 designs and were a very strong investment by Red Wing Potteries into producing a higher-end line while the U.S. was at war in World War II. Murphy volunteered and his service for World War II and left the Red Wing area for a couple of years at that time. He was a trained artist and a sculptor, and he introduced more pottery figures when he returned to Red Wing. After returning from World War II, among the very first lines that Murphy introduced at Red Wing Potteries was a very modernist style, which often featured rectangular or square bases in the darker bronze color. They were a very popular seller and an early representation of what was going on in the modernist design at this time. In 1949, Charles Murphy left for a better paying job at Stetson China Company in Lincoln, Illinois. The management at Red Wing Potteries once again returned to Belle Kogan for her design skills. With a new president at the helm of Red Wing Potteries, Murphy returned as a designer for Red Wing Potteries and was designing during the celebration of the pottery's 75th anniversary in 1953. He created new designs and he resurfaced some of his previous designs in a black matte glaze which were speckled with white over the top, which was his Oxford line, and he did overlay glazed items where he did gray over luster burgundy and where he did white over luster black. Murphy followed this with introducing the various fleck glazes in the colors of the 1950s. There was the Zephyr Pink, the Zephyr Fleck Blue, Fleck Yellow, Fleck Green, and some Fleck Tan pieces of the time. In 1955, introduced the Sgraffito line, the only line of Red Wing that actually had carving on the outside of it. In 1962, Red Wing Potteries again hired Belle Kogan, and she developed the many angular shapes of her prismatique designs. In 1963, Belle Kogan added some more pieces at Red Wing Potteries. These were named the Belle line. In 1959, Charles Murphy proudly introduced the Decorator line in blue and in silver green and burnt orange glazes. These were a crystalline glaze that he was very proud of developing, and from this glaze arose some of his favorite pieces. Murphy introduced his Doric ensemble in 1960 in this deep reddish orange glaze, which was called Bittersweet, the bright purple or amethyst glaze, and his bright blue or Riviera blue glaze. His hand-painted Crobeline appeared also in 1960. Decorators sat at spinning wheels to apply the stripes that encircle all of these pieces. These pieces were decorated in rust and green, as well as in blue and yellow combinations. In 1963, Charles Murphy added another interesting design to the potteries at Red Wing. These were white vases that were characterized by applied cherubs to the surface of the vase, raised figures that related to his sculpting skills. Murphy designed multiple ashtrays and flower pots during the 1950s and 1960s, at a time when smoking was not considered to be dangerous. He proudly introduced his large, huge pots of the Decorator planters for Red Wing in the 1960s. Murphy was particularly proud of the giraffe planter that he had designed and always kept one in his personal collection. With the increasing competition from overseas markets, an untimely strike in 1967 closed the Red Wing Potteries permanently. In the years of major art pottery production, over 2,000 different shapes were created in many assorted styles, from classic to modernist and everything in between. Not only were many styles used, but these shapes were produced in many different glazes to meet the taste from users from all walks of life. Enjoy your tour as you explore the wonderful world of pottery made in Red Wing.